In this video, we'll talk about imaginary units as an introduction to complex variables and complex algebra. In math, we define a real number to be anything that we could take the square of something that's non-negative. So conversely, an imaginary number or a non-real number is whenever we're taking the square root of a negative value. So we introduced this unit called an imaginary unit to help us move forward with the math whenever this arises. And we define it as I is equal to square root of -1. And we use this definition to keep doing algebra whenever this sort of thing arises. So we can do some examples to help us get comfortable with the idea of the definition of I. And so let's do the first one together. Right here, we have the square root of -12, which essentially is the same thing as the square root of -1 times 12. So this would be written like -1 times 12. And here you could do algebra to simplify this further, because 12 is the same thing as 2 times 6, or 2 times 3, or 2 times 2 times 3. So we have a pair of 2's that we can take out of the radical and keep the 3 inside. So now this thing turns into 2 root 3 times I. That's how you would simplify something like that. The example will show you here in a second, but to simplify something like these, the best method is to realize that I squared is equal to -1, because, theoretically speaking, like for this imaginary unit, if you square this imaginary unit, you'd have a -1. So then if you use that fact, you can like now turn this like 27 into like a 13, and then be like I squared raised to the 13, which gives you 26. So regardless, this is still just 1, and if it's an even number, if it's an even square of the square of this thing, then it'll be +1, and if it's odd, then it'll be -1. So this right here is -1, and this is still 26. So, well, I just ended up doing the whole thing. This is 26 times another I, because we have 27I. So this whole thing ends up being -I. So let's go ahead and check ourselves and see what it looks like. All right, so as we were doing, we noticed that this is a -12, which is the same thing as root 12 times root -1, which can now be written as 2 root 3 times I. Here we realize that I squared is equal to -1. And if we turn this 27 into like a 26, or I times I squared raised to the 13, then I could realize that this is -1 raised to an odd power, which means that it's not going to be even. It's going to be, well, duh, because I just said it was an odd power. Meaning that since it's an odd power, it's going to remain negative and not be squared to be a +1. So we have a -1 times whatever we have left over, which is I. So this is how we get -I. Um, Example 3 is nearly identical in the process. The only difference is that I to the -2 is not necessarily. Oh, actually, no, I think it would still be -1 because we would have 1 over I squared. So yeah, example 3, same exact process. So hopefully this kind of gives you some understanding of how to use I. And when we move forward into doing some complex algebra, this like math nuance will make sense to you.